what we're going to do here, Joel's presentation a lot was trying to get you to look at things differently, think about things differently. We're going to try to take it to the next level of this presentation and talk a little bit more about the principles of soil health. Kind of dovetailing right into that, we saw an interesting quote the other day, just to kind of start it off and tie it together. Too many people answer the questions, too few people question the answers. Now what I've been seeing with you guys today, you're doing a little bit better job of questioning the answers, which is good, which is good. Sometimes you don't know if you're always getting very good interaction or feedback. The communication is not a one-way process. Communication is a two-way process. If I just sit up here and wah, nobody's getting anything out of it. I'm learning just like what Joel, I'm learning from you guys. When you guys ask a question, chances are I may or may not have heard it before, and I may think I have the answer, and Mike's sitting in the back, ooh, 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 you know, I know what the answer is, and collectively maybe we can figure it out. Talking a little bit with Teresa just before, and she kind of got me going again. Right after lunch sometime I kind of go down a little bit. I'm not quite back to 100%. Joel, he's all energy usually when he's up here. You actually saw a very calm version of him. I think what happened is there wasn't much room to operate here, so he didn't get carried away. Down in Monte Vista he was migrating around, and he was getting pretty excited. But anyway, I'm gonna kind of jump in here. If you guys want to stop, if you want to raise your hand, fine, or if you obviously want to throw the flag, that's certainly a good deal. We can stop and talk about this. By the end of this presentation, you will be able to understand and discuss the 4 principles of soil health, understand and evaluate the applicability of certain methods used to accomplish the 4 principles. One of the other things we talked about during the break, we're not going to come here and explain how you guys need to do this here or wherever you happen to be. We're not going to have all the answers. But rather than sitting back and saying, I don't think that's going to work here, I don't see how we can make it work here, if we can do nothing else for our farmers or even our agency folks, is to ask the question, how could I do it here? If I was going to adopt this system, this strategy, this approach, rather than figuring out why it won't work, I'm sure there's a number of reasons why it might not work or wouldn't work, let's figure out how could we make it work here in a 9-inch rainfall area with high evaporations and lots of sunshine. And you know, you're pretty close to the desert here. In fact, you guys are kind of a high mountain desert, did you say?
You get outside the canals, it is the desert.
Outside the, yeah. The 4 principles, we're just going to kind of put them up here one at a time, just for dramatic effects. We've learned all kinds of cool little tools here. We've been playing around with these presentations, and we know about as much about PowerPoint as we do about our soils. It's a very small fraction of the potential of what our software can do, I'm telling you. That doesn't keep us from moving on, okay? Have you guys all seen this before? Does it all look familiar?
Yeah.
Okay. We've worded it a little bit differently from what we originally saw them. We've wordsmithed it a lot. Essentially, when we were trying to come up with, most people think this is just about cropland. It's not just about cropland. It's not about rangeland. It's not just about pasture land. It's really all ag, producing ag lands. Sometimes, and we don't want to limit ourselves about what we can and can't do. So here's a question. This is the question and answer time. So why would we want to keep the soil covered at all times? Just throw something out for anybody to jump in.
Capture anything that comes from the sky.
Capture anything. Now, I like this guy. He's ahead of the curve. That's good. What else?
Reduce ET.
Reduce ET. Anything else?
Keep the soil from blowing.
Keep the soil from blowing. Hear that, Mike? That might work down in good old SLB, right? Keep it covered. I will say one thing. I got in a bit of a philosophical debate with some other folks on the soil health category. I said, this is the most important principle. Oh, no, 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 no. All the principles are important. There's no one principle more important than the other. I'm telling you, if you guys don't keep the soil covered at all times, that's what's going to hold up the show right there. Until you can figure out, whether it's through crop rotations, cover crops, adding manure, adding compost, somehow you've got to figure out a way to keep the soil covered before you can begin this journey, in my opinion. Okay? Any other things before I jump in here? Kind of put the answers on here. You're not going to give them the test, are you, Mike? You're not going to make them answer all those questions, are you?
Afterwards.
Oh, afterwards. Okay, so pay attention. Protect soil from water and wind erosion. that would catch most of this. Increase infiltration. I like that answer, to capture anything that would come from the sky. That's actually a pretty good answer, quite frankly. Reduce the soil temperatures. Part of the reason we have to keep it covered, when the sunlight directly strikes the soil, bare soil, it heats up fairly quickly. And that happens even in wintertime, but particularly in the summertime. I don't know if you guys have ever tried to do that, but go out sometime in the middle of July, and I know it gets over 100 over here. I mean, Grand Junction gets pretty hot in the summer. Take a little test and see what the temperature is right on the soil surface. If you're more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, you're starting to cook the little bugs in the soil. Joel talked a lot about the herd below ground. As that temperature moves down in the soil, you're starting to reduce that soil's ability biologically to function at the high level, like what we're talking about here. Reduce evaporation, kind of talked about that a little bit. Reduce weed pressure. Not always the first thing that comes to mind. When we were in Trail City, South Dakota, we've got another slide, it'll come up here in a little bit. It was interesting, and this guy's been no-tilling for quite a while, and he's been using a lot of diversity and doing some kind of outside-the-box things. He's very good friends with Joe Clapperton, who Mike mentioned earlier. But we got to noticing when we were out in this crop field, he had a place in the middle where the rows had skipped. And even where the rows had skipped, he still had the soil covered at all times. There was actually very little weed pressure. This little square that we have in the middle of the table here, there was probably 4 or 5 little weeds. I don't know what they were. They looked like little kochias or something. I wasn't quite sure what the weeds were, but they wasn't causing a significant economic impact to his bottom line. They were there, they were weeds, they were a plant out of place. It really wasn't the target crop. But because that soil was covered, and more importantly, undisturbed, and we'll get to that in a minute, the weeds really weren't that much of a problem. The residue is food for the microbes. Joel talked a lot about that underground herd. Simply by building up that residue on the soil surface, in addition to all these other benefits, ultimately, we're going to need to feed the herd below ground. And Joel hit on that a little bit. I think that's very good, but I think it's a key point. I find this interesting. We saw this slide originally. I believe it was a gentleman who's an ag engineer at University of Nebraska, Dr. Paul Yassa. He talked about how uniformity is the key. In our country, particularly in that dryland area, and it's even true in the irrigated area, even when they're doing a fairly good job and they've got it covered, almost invariably, if they're doing any kind of tillage, the first thing they're going to want to do, they're going to want to go out there and incorporate that residue so they can get it broke down, get that volunteer crop back in the system, and start preparing that seed bed for the next crop. I mean, they get it right, but it lasts about a month. And then they start destabilizing the system. It's all about a mindset. You guys have all heard of soil primers, right? Everybody talks about it all the time, right? Teresa?
Soil primers?
Soil primers with a question. That's an interesting.
Is that a new natural primer for painting houses? What are you talking about? Soil
It could be.
Talking about
It
early
could be.
successional species?
Could be. Basically, we actually changed this slide. Originally, and Mike brought this up, about a month ago. He goes, now you're going to do your cover crop talk, right? I thought, man, Mike, this is not a cover crop talk. So I'm like, how are we going to redefine this? We can't just make it all about cover crops. And too oftentimes what I see happen is, that's that stuff where you use cover crops. At Quivira Coalition, what was that, in November, correct? Is that when, Jay, you didn't go down there? Joel Clapperton, Gabe Brown, and some other folks went down and did some presentations. Joel talked about this deal on TED, ideas were spreading, I think is the tagline to the TED site, where the, always keeps you on your toes a bit. Oh, it's right there. Hiding in plain sight. Anyway, Gabe Brown's son, I pick up where I left off, he came up with the notion of soil primers. And if you go look at the practice standard for cover crops and look at what they do, one of the things that's not talked about, I think this probably needs to be added, because one of the things that does cover crops, or we're going to call them soil primers for the purpose of this, is to help set the table to get good things to happen. Oftentimes what happens in a conventional, you mentioned wheat fallow, particularly like in Kiowa County. Wheat fallow would actually be a terrible system. We're gonna discover a little bit more about that in a little bit. It's a single species, cool season grass, followed by a dead period or a long period without anything growing. I mean, one of our producers the other day, if a wheat gets up more than this high, he's out there spraying it. Luckily he's spraying, it's not plowing, but he's keeping it dead 60% of the time in order to try to grow the one thing he's trying to grow, which is winter wheat. What this does though, the diverse multi-species cover crops helps to patch up the weaknesses in the rotation. And I would suggest that wheat after wheat, or even corn, is a weak rotation. We talked a little bit on break with Wayne. At least in alfalfa, you have a perennial species working there. You're not disturbing the soil, you're not plowing it once you get it established. So you have some of the things going on here that kind of makes this work. But there's some other things you could probably do to even make it better. This is a picture. We went on a tour in September of 2011 and went to Blaine, Nebraska. And essentially what we did there, Green Cover Seed, they're kind of one of the groups that kind of got out in front of this, and we did a deal with the Northern Plains Technical Conference the other day, and that's on, I believe Mike has it posted on Ustream, but essentially what Green Covers, they got in the cover crop seed business. So we went there to kind of see what was going on, and this is a field where there's a series of trials going on where, and what's interesting about this particular crop was planted, I believe, on the second day of August in 2011. It's a 7-way multi-species cover crop. This picture was taken on September 17th of that same year. It's about 5 weeks old. What's interesting about this is right adjacent to this field, I lost a little pointer there. Right immediately adjacent to this, these strips are about as wide as the middle of this table here. Each of these species was planted as a single species monoculture adjacent to this mix. And each one of the species in a single species, none of them, and Joel talked about this a little bit, none of them was higher than this table. By themselves, those individual plants, with only them in the system, did not function as well as they did in this collaborative deal. Something's going on here. Biology, chemically, roots exchanging. We're going to talk about some other neat stuff here, but the key point, the take-home message I want to stress here is that soil primers or cover crops are really just a tool. Just like no-till is a tool. There's tools that will allow us to try to proceed down this path, but don't get caught up in it's just all about cover crops. It's more than that. Just recognize it's a tool, and we'll go on from there. Just a quick aside here, we had one of our board members who we had scheduled to go on this trip that we went up in 2011, and he thought we was going in October. We called him up the day before we're getting ready to leave in September, and he didn't have time to come up with a good excuse to why he couldn't go. We caught him on such short notice. It was like, you know, your wife can take care of the cows. I know they're calving right now, but that's okay. You know, the wheat's already in the bin. Come on and go with us. And he went with us, and when he came back, this is what he did in the following spring. This on a dryland system. But the point of this slide is even in a very limited moisture environment, here's what he was able to do. But look at the residue down underneath there. I can see a little bit of bare soil right here, but by and large, that soil surface is covered there, and we're actually getting something to grow. Looking at the soil sample, if you will, or the clods on the left, clods on the right, do you see any differences between the two?
Color.
Color, first thing?
Moisture.
Moisture, okay.
The structure of the one,
The structure?
it looks like it's more porous and stuff. than the one on the right.
This one over here looks more porous. I always hear people call it cottage cheese looking. It's kind of got that little aggregate stability. Anything else? I think that about covers it. One other thing we did mention in here, the roots are kind of similar, but some people look over here and they go, well, that looks like it maybe has more roots. But fair enough either way. Whether it does or doesn't, I'm not really here to say. 20 years of similar tillage intensity, but what's different? The one on the left simply, it was crop rotations with crop residues. This one also in the rotation included soil primers or cover crops and animal manure. So obviously, just on a quick glance, you can tell something's going on over here that probably is better than what's going on over there. It's not an absolute statement, but it's at least an indication just based on a visual observation. Principle number 2, disturbing the soil as low as possible. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but why would we want to do that?
Well, it kills the bacteria or animals in the soil if you disturb it too much, because it changes their environment.
Okay, that's actually a big one. Good. Anybody else?
Leach organic matter.
Okay,
But
through the same, yep, that process.
Break
Okay,
down the soil structure.
soil structure. Typically, the major impact is not happening deeper than you've ever tilled. But certainly, as you're changing, whether you're taking back the residue with that process, or even the act of planting, most people are like, well, you gotta plant. Sure you do, but there's a way to do it where you can disturb the soil less. Whether or not you have row cleaners on, whether or not it's a single disc or multi-disc, whether or not they're 6.5 inches apart or 10 inches apart. I mean, all those things are factors, but disturbing as little as possible. Reduce soil moisture loss. Simply the act of raking back that residue, you're opening up that soil surface so that the sun strikes the soil and can help volatilize the water out. If you're in a very water limited environment, that could be a problem. Keeping the residue on the surface, it kind of seems to make sense when you think about it a little bit. Reduce or eliminate compaction. One of the things I didn't think about, and this was up until just recently, soil, while it is an aqua system, there's air. There's air flowing through that soil. When you run, whatever it is, 10,000, 15, 20,000 ton trucks and tractors and implements over that soil, you're squishing out the air in that. And by doing that, you're impeding the soil's ability to function. Now, Joel talked a little bit about this aggregate stability up at Dr. Beck's at Dakota Lakes. That's part of what that natural system can do when it's functioning properly. Certainly compaction is one of those things that impedes soil's ability to function at the highest level. Prevents formation of plow and hard pans, impervious to roots of water. The gentleman who worked back, I'm curious if you remember this guy, Wes Robbins. He was the area agronomist over on the Eastern Plains. He worked out of Burlington a little bit. He's doing consulting work. He's actually beyond retiring from the ES. I think he retired from the NRCS after like 37 years. But he did a field day and we went out and looked, and they started showing, when you rake back the dirt, he started showing where those plow pans were. And typically, depending on how deep that soil was ever plowed, that's where that impervious layer was. And there might be several of them right in there, but typically somewhere down below that deepest layer, the soil was fine. It was just man-made compaction largely from what's being dragged behind the tractor. A lot of times people think compaction is just the tires. It's actually, a lot of times, you think about a blade plow or even a disc for that matter, running through that soil, the PSI right there where that's cutting has got to be tremendous. And particularly if you're doing it in a wet soil, it's going to be even a more severe impact than it would be in a completely dry soil. Improves aggregate stability and infiltration. It's kind of a long-term effect, but it is kind of the holy grail of what we're shooting for in a properly functioning system. Additional considerations, we've kind of also touched on this too, promoting diversity and balance of soil life. Rather than hurting the things you're actually trying to get, let's at least consider to try to prevent getting rid of those things because of trying to eliminate the things we don't want. Beneficials, same thing, all that soil life, that herd underground. We're going to try to maintain that habitat at the optimal level for them. I asked a guy, as a matter of fact, this was in Kiowa County, I said, y'all have earthworms out here? And they all kind of sat around like, well, no, don't you know we live in a desert? And I said, why don't we have earthworms out here? And the guy said, well, we haven't created the environment for them. That's exactly that. The earthworms, if the environment is created, so, enough for them to live in, if they can thrive and survive there, they're probably going to be there. But if the way you're managing, you manage that system where that environment's not there, chances are you're not going to find any earthworms. Bacteria thrive in disturbed compacted soils, consume the organic matter. We kind of touched on that in a little bit. As I understand it, simply that active tillage increases, they multiply, the copiocratic bacteria multiply, and they begin to chew up soil organic matter and burn through the carbon. Mike touched on that a little bit earlier. A lot of these guys that have been doing this a long time, what they're saying is that carbon is actually the limiting factor. If we can't maintain, not only maintain, but build that carbon reservoir in the soil, we're always going to be challenged. We're always going to be limiting what the potential is for that particular site. Weed control. We talked about this a little bit earlier. I'm going to kind of jump in here. Rick Beaver's saying was, if you don't plant the weeds, they won't grow. And he heard this from somewhere. I think his grandmother had a lot of wise quotes, and he quotes her a lot, but it kind of makes sense. If that weed seed is buried in that soil, and you haven't done anything to optimize the advantage of it over the growing crop, chances are it may just lay there. A gentleman by the name of, I think it's Dave Pratt, who does Ranching for Profit. Any of you guys seen his stuff? He did his master's work out in California, and one of the things they did for his master's thesis, they took a meter of soil, 1 centimeter deep, and they divided it up into little square little deals, and they watered them all just to see what would happen. And what they found, there was about 50 or 60 species, different species that came up in that seed bank that was lying there. And some of those plant species had never been seen before on those sites. Kind of interesting stuff. I don't know what it proves or disproves. I just think it's kind of interesting. That seed bank is probably there, and if optimal conditions get right, I know, for example, I've got a situation where I noticed something come up one year. It was dry, and all of a sudden, what's this stuff coming up? And we got to look around. It was purslane. It was everywhere. It's like, I never have seen this before. It was there the whole time, but the conditions got right to where it showed itself, and that stuff just came out like gangbusters. Actually had kind of a neat little crop, but I didn't know what it was when I first saw it. Your best herbicide is the seed you plant. That was something else we also saw at Rick Beaver's. Essentially, by keeping that soil covered and deciding what you wanted to grow and what you didn't grow, simply by selecting the seeds you plant, you could do that. Nature will fill plant voids with weeds. Joel has a comment that he said all the time, and I think it came from one of his mentors. Mother Nature is not a nudist. But what we've decided is she really is an opportunist. If there's a bare piece of ground out there, chances are she's going to find something to fill that bare spot with. So just kind of conceptually a thought there. Burn down is a good farming practice. We're not saying don't ever go out and spray your weeds, or you can't spray, or you shouldn't spray. At least consider what the long-term ramifications would be for spraying. Jonathan Lundgren, who is, he did the speech, or he did a little talk up in Bismarck the other day, and Mike also has that on the Ustream. He's an ARS scientist out of Brookings, South Dakota. One of the more interesting talks, if not the most interesting talk I've heard from that deal, and he talks about just considering environmentally what happens. If you're trying to kill that one bug, or that one weed, or that one fungus that you think you have to get rid of to grow it, chances are you may kill up to 10 other species that would have actually been beneficial, that would have helped. So what you do by doing the one thing that you think you're trying to get rid of, manage against what you don't want, you've actually destabilized that whole ecosystem, not only the below ground, but the above ground. Weed spectrum changes, again, a lot of what we saw up there, weeds weren't really a problem if the system was being managed properly. I will tell you this, on Gabe Brown's farm, and even there at, we're going to see a little bit of an oak in here in a little bit, I saw a lot of weeds that on first glance, I saw more of them this time, I kind of go, oh man, there's a lot of weeds here. Weeds weren't really a problem once you recognized what the long-term big goal of how you could make this system work. Seed predators and decomposition. If you get the biology active in the soil, things start to happen, and some of these seeds actually become consumed by the little critters down under. You saw that little video that Joel put up the clip with Archuleta and Sticka. A lot going on down in there, in the trigosphere and on the soil surface. I was amazed. You had mentioned the thing about carrots earlier. Reminded me of something happened about a month ago. It was bitter cold one day. I did the same kind of thing he did with the board. He tells a story about getting carrots to grow in Kiowa County. So I'm going to have to bring this information back to those folks so we can help them out here. But essentially there's a board laying there next to the corral. It's about 18 degrees and snow's flying around. And I turn it over and it's just crawling with those little critters, Helgamites or whatever, all those. They're just crawling with those guys. I'm like, well, this is kind of cool, but it's the same thing. The habitat on the bottom side of that board was a habitat that they could grow and thrive in, even in that system. They wasn't doing anything anywhere else, but under there was a habitat that they could survive in. Kind of a neat little visual representation. Essentially what it's trying to demonstrate is the negative effects from the increased amount of tillage, both the depths and the severity, and what that does to your soil organic matter and how that affects how the system works. Okay, you think about this. Yes.
What are you talking about subsoil tillage? I mean, isn't all of that subsoil tillage? I just don't understand, I didn't understand what you.
I think it's a fair question. I think it's a fair question. I think what they're trying to show here, typically with chisel tillage, for example, what I've seen is it's going to be on a 40-inch center or a 30-inch center. And so you're going to go through there and you're going to turn up a clod.
I know what.
And so between the rows, there's going to be an undisturbed area. Fair enough? Typically with a mow board, at least in my experience, and you guys, does anybody still do mow board plowing over here?
Yeah.
Everybody.
They do.
Really common. A lot of-
So what does it look, how deep does it go in? How deep does it go in? Deep. A foot.
Sometimes more.
Why does it go deeper?
You just must go deeper.
Well,
You
it
know,
much
it gets
deeper,
muddy.
it's not heavy soils too.
There may not be a physical way to go deeper, otherwise they might go deeper. Paul Yassa has this wonderful video, and it's almost the metamorphosis of tillage equipment. He starts off with talking about this, and next thing you know, he's got this thing with a shank on it over his head. He goes, okay, now we're gonna fix that problem, we're gonna go fix that. I wish I had that slide now, because it really illustrates this. But typically the moldboard, what's interesting, and I couldn't get my mind around this when I first saw it, because I thought, oh my God, that's terrible. But a lot of times when it comes over, it's in a big chunk. Plop, plop. Think about it. Just the way that implement works, it's maintaining, these pads are still in there. We haven't quite got them degraded yet. We plowed it plenty deep, but we haven't blasted it apart. What this is saying is basically we're going through there and we're pulling it up, we're turning it over, and we're breaking the clods up. You know, a lot of times they'll have a little soil conditioner run behind the implement to further make sure we poke the residue to soil contact to break up the clods.
I used to chisel 2 or 3 times afterwards to prepare the seed bed, so that's probably what,
Yeah.
that would be the.
I think it's a fair question, and in fact, I think it's a good question, because when I first saw this, I was just like you. I'm like, well, tell me why this is 1X, 2X, 3X. I think there's something to it, but particularly with the moldboard, I couldn't, well, you know, you're going really deep. You have to be doing, but that one pass by itself doesn't effectively, it's not as bad as, it's worse than this, but not as bad as that.
The
Okay.
weeds, they do, the chisel, they do a lot of that for getting rid of the weeds in the fallow, you know, because we used to, when I worked at the co-op, we used to sell a lot of chisels, you know.
Yeah, and there's actually, take a little sidebar here a little bit. So people that are in the chisel selling business, they'd probably be too crazy about everybody just running out and adopting no-till and going part of the chisel, right? We got to sell these things. Guy came up, somebody asked about the fertilizer business. Dr. Rick Haney, I saw him speak in Pratt, Kansas the other day. He said, man, a guy from Kansas City came up to me in the airport the other day and said, man, you guys are going to put us out of business. We're trying to sell fertilizer here. And he caught him, and this guy's a very good speaker. He's very, very folksy and down to earth. You know, he works for ARS in Temple, Texas. But anyway, he kind of gets, I don't want to say he gets in the guy's face, but he says, look, right now there's about 1,000 people in the U.S. doing this at the level that we're talking about. And oh, by the way, if somebody in China offered you $20 a ton more for your fertilizer, who would you sell it to? Oh, well, I guess I'd go sell it to China. He's like, exactly. The market's going to figure this thing out. And if you're at the co-op, maybe you need to get in the seed business. I mean, maybe there's another business that's going to be the business you get in. But at some point, the thing about the tillage is also kind of interesting. Rolf Derbs, and we're going to have a couple of things on him later, he talks about in South America, they have a whole generation of farmers that never have known any other way to farm than what we're talking about here. They didn't have the curse of having a big industrial complex that could build metal equipment to go do these things like the deep tillage. They didn't have abundant fossil fuels down there that they could just go and apply fertilizers that we basically make with the use of fossil fuels. So they had to figure out a different way to do it. They were forced into it, but they didn't realize they were forced into it. Given the constraints they had, how are we going to do this? And they figured out a way to do it. So, we've all seen this slide before, correct? In some form or fashion. If you were going to declare war on these guys right here, the underground herd, bacteria, protozoa, nematodes, fungus, all the little critters that helps that nutrient cycling process we talked about earlier, all you really need to do is this. And by doing this, what you're doing is you're cutting off the food and water supply. When you cut off the food and water supply, you begin to destabilize that system. And what you're doing when you destabilize that system, you may be able to prepare the seed bed for the next crop, but more than likely what you've done is you've taken a short-term fix and you've actually compromised the system to create a long-term problem. It gets to be this perpetual cycle, and it cannot be a short-term, well, now I've got these messy tracks out there, I got to go out there and plow and smooth them up, I got to get this evened up. I've got this residue I've got to get incorporated in the soil. Typically, it is a short-term knee-jerk reaction to a problem without considering the long-term implications of what the farmer is doing. Kind of just a neat quote here. I'll let you guys read that quote. Similar to what Joel mentioned with the Hugh Hammond Bennett quote earlier, essentially the summary of this is everything affects everything. There's a quote made by Chief Seattle. It was true in 1854. It's true right now. It's still true. Everything affects everything. And that's really what we're trying to say when we think about the soil food web. Incorporating as many different species of plants and animals as practical. This is one of those things we had to wordsmith quite a bit. Doing something as much as possible. Well, what's possible? Well, a lot of things are possible, okay? But what's really practical? One of the things that we come into, a producer comes in and says, well, I don't have livestock anymore. I don't own cows. I don't own sheep. That may not be practical on your operation. The same is true with your crop rotation. I mean, maybe you're in an area to where you can grow oats, you can grow field peas, you can grow alfalfa, you can grow, does anybody grow millet over here? Anybody at all? Nobody's growing millet, right? Okay.
And they might, very rarely.
Very rare. There's a certain number of species, though, that farmers have figured out are going to work here. I'm guessing they tried some things that didn't work at some point along the line. Okay? By the way, that was over here right where we turned on Horizon, just off 70. I think that was a cornfield there, correct? Is that a cornfield or something? Right here next to the interstate? Anybody ringing a bell with them?
Oh, you mean this?
It's real close here.
Yeah, there's two little fields.
Somewhere real close here. That is corn?
Yeah, that's what they put in their last few years.
Okay. Just a take-home message here. We're going to get to this in a little bit, but I caught that. One of the things I did catch, trying to catch Mike going down the interstate. He wanted to get over here, and he wanted to get over here bad.
We'll need to edit that out.
Thank you very much for that work.
So, why would we want to do that? Why would we want to put as many different... Joel talked about this earlier, about mimicking nature. You know, Teresa and I talked about this on the break. Why would you want to mimic nature? Why would you want to try to, do something that we haven't done before? That's what I find kind of interesting about what Wayne's doing. If nothing else, whether this works or doesn't work, I think it's the first step. Let's see if we can do it. Let's see if we can add another annual species to a perennially established species. When I was a little kid, I learned of a story, actually. My grandfather died way before I was born. In 1943, my grandfather, he was basically an imported sheep man from Texas. They came up and they bought this big ranch. And it was basically short grass prairie, and the way it was when he was there, buffalo, blue grama, primarily dominated by warm species. And he was kind of a rounder, gambled, ran around a lot, partied. He was a typical cowboy. But he decided, there's a lot of money to be made in this wheat. And so he went out, he bought some seed wheat, and he planted 1,000 acres. He didn't go plow it up first. He simply drilled right into the native range. And the next year he cut about a 30-bushel wheat crop. So why did that work? I mean, okay, well, what happened here? You've got basically a system dominated by a warm species grass, and you're going to go in there and plant an annual species of cool season grass, something that's out of sync with that. And he basically did something that I didn't know, they're calling it pasture cropping now, but he did something that actually worked and worked quite well. And he never did it again. He got away with it once, but it worked. And why did it work? There's something going on here, and I think there's going to be some things we'll pick up on later. Just to kind of give you a laundry list of what we came up with here, for the reasons you might want to do that. One last thing on the livestock. An educator named Mark Watson from Alliance, Nebraska. he's been very successful. They have a lot of center pivots and they have a lot of dry land. And he's one of the interesting no-till guys. He's been doing no-till presentations for about 20 years. He doesn't have livestock, but his nephews do. So you don't necessarily have to own the livestock to be able to incorporate that above-ground animal component to the system. You still need to be able to call the shots and make them do what you want to do, but livestock, just like cover crops or no-till, is a tool. It's a tool. Most people, it's kind of like you're so busy working in the business, you're not working on the business. You don't have to own the cows. In fact, some of the most successful people in the cow business said the only thing you have to do to really be successful in the cow business, you have to own a Cadillac and a cell phone. The rest of it is all just how you manage things. Just a little something to think about. Take-home message here, the whole's greater than the sum of the parts, goes right back to our Chief Seattle quote. Interestingly enough, I've got nitrogen fixation here. One of the things I heard in Pratt, Kansas the other day, kind of intriguing a little bit, Ray Archuleta talked about how do we make nitrogen fertilizer? That was his question. Anybody know how we make it? What do we use to make nitrogen fertilizer? Somebody said natural gas. The natural gas, that's right, it's got a lot of nitrogen in it, right? Everybody kind of looked around, he goes, no, nitrogen's in the air, and BJ talked about this earlier, 78% of this is nitrogen. This is free, it's right here, right? In order for man to convert this element to this liquid fertilizer or anhydrous ammonia that we use, as I understand it, it takes about 450 degrees Fahrenheit and about 450 psi to make this thing into this product that we can use, and it's free right here. Plants, nitrogen-fixing plants, can do the same thing at root and temperature at 1 atmospheric pressure. Just something to consider. There might be another way to do it that's going to be a lot less inputs, both from fossil fuels as well as a way to grow something naturally on your farm, something that you need without having to go to town and buy it. Years and years ago, it was kind of interesting, and I heard this in one of those seminars I was in. It said, back in the old days, people used to produce products on the ranch, and then they hauled them to town and they sold them for profit. Nowadays, the next generation thinks we go to town and we buy stuff in town and we haul them back to the ranch. Something to think about. Crop rotations, it's not, we talked a little bit earlier about cover crops. There's ways you can get diversity in your crop rotation simply by selecting crop rotations. If you guys look in the practice standard for conservation crop rotation, it's actually written pretty darn well. Just think about how you would do it. One of the things in our area, nobody in our area that I'm aware of is growing field peas, winter peas or spring peas, because, well, we've just never done that before. We think that's something that we can do on our area that will get this cool season broadleaf into the system. And maybe it's every third or fourth year in the rotation, but in, say, a wheat, grain sorghum, and maybe in that fallow period, rather than coming back out of wheat and going into a long fallow period, maybe that spring option might be a thing we could put some wheat in. So it's not just looking at cover crops here. Just a visual representation of what we talk about, some examples of how typically we plant crops in the monoculture, but getting one of each in there. Plants thrive in a natural, diverse system. I mentioned pasture cropping a little bit earlier. The gentleman named Colin Seiss, we met a couple of years ago. Joel actually met him originally on that first tour to Bismarck in January, which I make it a point never to go to Bismarck in January. But I waited the following week and I met him in Salina. It's much nicer in Salina. But he, for lack of a better term, invented this notion about pasture cropping. I'm just going to take a brief little sidebar here. In Australia, and in 1979, he had about 2,000 hectares of land. His brother had the same. They inherited the farm from their dad. He had about 2,000 hectares, and his brother had about 2,000 hectares. A fire came through and essentially wiped out the entire operation. It was basically a sheep operation. He also raises Kelpie dogs, and he farms wheat and oats and crops typically that they've grown in Australia. Fire came through, burnt the fence posts, all the barns, the houses, the vehicles, the equipment, everything. The sheep, I mean, they were stacked up like cordwood. It was absolute devastation. He basically lost everything and really had no way to support himself in that system. You remember Joel talked about these guys hitting the wall? I talked about Priest about this on a break. In our area, the guys that are highly successful are the least likely guys you're going to reach. It's not because they're not the smartest. It's not because they have these special talents, but they're actually a victim of their own success. Things are operating at such a high level, it's like, don't confuse me with that, I've got this thing figured out. The people that are willing to take a look at this, oftentimes, especially the people that are doing this at a high level, they ran across a crisis that absolutely stopped them cold in their tracks. Something happened that became this immovable object that they could no longer do things the way they were doing because they just came across a challenge that was insurmountable. And that's what happened to Colin Sykes. Everything was burnt out. He tells some humorous stories about how they crawled in a beer bottle for a while, and in this drunken stupor they came up with this idea about pasture cropping. And essentially what pasture cropping was based on is, let's try to work with Mother Nature. They could no longer afford to go buy the fertilizer. They were broke. They didn't have the money. They didn't have the equipment to go do the things like they used to do. Combines, everything was burned up. I mean, they were in a bad situation. But what they did, essentially he divided his farm into what might be characterized as a 4-paddock deal. And so each year, the sheep would get 1/4 of this, basically 500 hectares. A portion of it was just rested. 1/4 of it was cropped, some kind of an annual crop. And then the other one was like their drought pasture, and sometimes they came in and did a spring, fall grazing. But basically they were using the sheep to harvest what they had. When that fire came through, that system was dominated by 3 native species that were indigenous to the area at the time. After 20+ years of him doing the system he's doing, I'll talk about that a little bit, they did a range judging contest the other day. They went out there and there was 140 different species out there on his farm. What's interesting, and one of the crops they grow is oats. And he's got some pictures of these 70-bushel oats. But these oats essentially are drilled directly into the perennial grass. They do spray right before they go plant the oats. They do go in there with a herbicide, and one time they hit it and they knock it back, because what they're trying to do is create non-competitive cover for the oats. There's a window of opportunity in there where they need to set back that perennial stand, in his opinion, in order to allow that next annual crop to come in and grow. Through doing that, and basically by, he's only harvesting a crop that you physically haul to town on 1/4 of his operation in any given year. So over a 4-year period, only one of those is actually a crop going to town. They do also harvest grass seeds, so by default they are taking some seed off that, and that's also been a very profitable business. It only came about because out of necessity, they realized there was an opportunity over here. We haven't put anything into this crop. The sheep are over here, the oats are over here, we're resting over here, and we've got grass seed over here, and it's a commodity we can take and sell. We didn't have to fertilize it. We didn't have to do anything special. The land is giving us back something like the ranches of old. We're going to take it from the ranch, we're going to haul it to town and turn it to cash. Incidentally, he's making about the same amount of gross dollars he was about 20 years ago before all this happened. But the costs are actually going down. His cost, today's costs, are about $20,000 a year, less than his costs were 20 years ago. What else is really cool about Colin is his brother next door is still doing the same thing that Grandpa did. So anytime he needs to go catch a shot or an example of how not to do it, basically, right across the fence, he can run. And he said, my brother, who's never left Australia, has no idea that I'm using him as an example of what not to do all over the world. Somebody asked him, I didn't think of this, but somebody raised their hand in one of these conferences and asked him, they said, why didn't your brother change? Why can't your brother look over and see what's going on? And he said, I've been asked that question a lot. And he said, the only thing I can think of, he said, my brother was about 9 years older than me, and I think he just always thought he was smarter than me, and so he never bothered to look across the fence and see what was going on at my place. He just assumed he was doing it right and never looked back. He kind of put the blindfolders on. It's about believing what you can see or seeing what you can believe. A long, long story to explain this right here. But this is what Mother Nature wants to do. And you've seen this slide before. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. We're going to go ahead and populate everything here. Just consider this. The natural flow of energy is to go towards more diversity and more complexity. And basically by our management, we're always trying to push the system somewhere back in here. There's nothing wrong with that. Just recognize what the natural environment wants to do. Just recognize there's a price. If you go with the flow and take the path of least resistance, you're going to trend over this way. That's exactly what happened to Colin Sykes. He simply didn't elect so much as he got caught up in the current. he was drugged over here. It wasn't voluntarily that he did this. It happened. And so what he did is he figured out the only way I can make that work here is to do what he did. Okay? All right.
I can answer the question. You know, he
Yeah.
said he sprayed before he planted. I noticed in a lot of the other videos that I watched, they roller them down or something, you know, I mean, they just take the cover crop and roll it down rather than kill it. They just, and so, what, I mean, like, why does he do that? I mean, you know, is that more efficient for what he's doing, or why, you know, why might he be doing that? I was wondering.
I can honestly say I don't know the answer to that specific question. I think he's figured out a way he can make it work. I'm sure somewhere else there's another way to do it, obviously. The other thing they do, he's still fertilizing, but he's only using about a third of the fertilizer he was using before. When they plant those oat crop, they put on, he calls it super polish, I don't know exactly which chemical makeup it is. They're not applying any in, by the way. I mean, the sheep, that natural system is cycling, it's doing it all, but they are putting in a little bit of phos, because when you take that grain crop off, you remember Joel showing the picture of the beef or the milk? I mean, you're taking nutrients off when you mine that crop, and I say mine it because that's what you're doing. You're mining the minerals off. You may not have realized it, but I mean, that's what's happening. Those minerals are going to town. Dwayne Beck over in Salina 2 years ago made what I thought was a very interesting comment along those lines. He goes, you know, we've got a really screwed up trade system here. He said, we're basically trading our nutrients for what? We're shipping over grain, and our nutrients are going over there. And what we're importing is oil. He goes, that may not be a sustainable system over time. Just something to think about. Living roots in the soil as long as possible. One of the things that came up yesterday in our discussion in Steamboat, somebody said, well, how cold does it get here? Oh, it gets down to 40 degrees. Well, 40 below. Oh, 40 below, okay. Well, it gets pretty cold here. The question I had, so is it possible to keep a living root in the soil when it's 40 below? Would that happen on your farm? Could there be a living root in the soil on your farm at 40 below?
He comes back, so I guess there's a living root down there.
Okay, probably so. So, and why would you want to do that? We've talked about this a little bit, but basically this system and all these components we've talked about, keeping a living root in the soil as much as possible, isn't that what happens in nature? I mean, in the forest, in your perennial pastures, they don't die all the way to the bottom and start over from seed. We talked a little bit earlier about Hugh Hammond Bennett. There's a video clip that came out on these soil stories, and I don't know exactly how to find it. I found it on YouTube. But essentially, she was talking about Hugh Hammond Bennett was out in the field, and we're gonna go with a very similar approximation here a little bit. He was walking across a plowed field in North Carolina, and it was very cloddy, it was very hard, it was rough to walk across, and he's kind of stumbling across it like this. And then right immediately adjacent to that field, he goes over into the forest, the natural system, which is covered with shade and all kinds of vegetation and stuff down there. He's walking across, and it's like walking across a mattress. It's very soft, it's very pliable, and the whole notion about why we plow, we have to soften this thing up and loosen it up and fluff it up so we can prepare that seed bed. But Mother Nature, right over here in the forest, was actually doing a better job by herself without any of those man-made inputs. It struck a chord with him, and I actually found a copy of the book. I have a copy of this book my father-in-law had, and it was published in 1946 where he talks about this. And interestingly enough, there's a section in chapter 10 that's all about cover crops. And what they knew at the time, they're talking about individual species here. There's nothing wrong with that, but they recognized way back when individual species have a role in what we could do to maybe interject that into a cropping system to maybe address some type of resource concern. Another thing I mentioned to Wayne on the break was something called the Albrecht Papers. I don't know if you guys have seen that. You might go do some research. He was a gentleman, I think he worked in Illinois and Missouri back in the 20s to the 40s, and they published some papers after his death. But he made some really interesting research just right on this topic. It was true then and it's true now. And I need to kind of read on a little bit more, but I'll just throw that name out there if anybody wants to take a look at it. Kind of makes sense. The one thing you're going to see here that's kind of new information, how many people in the room have heard of mycorrhizal fungi before Mike today? A few of you, okay? So was it because of your interest in the subject at the time you're in college, or did you just hear about it recently?
I worked in a mycorrhizal lab
A
for 5
mycorrhizal.
years.
We had a ringer in the audience yesterday too. He raised his hand every time I asked a question, and he knew the answer. He really knew the answer. Very good. We're going to show you some interesting things here. But consider this, what would be the effect of having plants growing in the soil for 9 to 12 months rather than 6 months? We talked about the sweet fallow thing earlier. When we very first heard Jay Fuhr talk in Byers, Colorado, that's the first thing. Joel and I was riding home, and that's the one thing that was a benefit for us. We got to go see the tour or the presentation, and then we had a 4 or 5 hour ride home. That was anytime you go to a presentation, that's the best thing you can do, is have some time after you got that presentation, rather than go right back to your desk and stick your nose back at whatever it was you was doing earlier this morning or on your lunch break. It's like you take that learning opportunity and you kind of flush it down the toilet, not on purpose, but just by the simple fact that you didn't have time to ruminate on what you just heard. So we were very lucky, and we're coming home, and that's the first thing I said, man, you know, these sweet fallow guys, this is a no-brainer for them, because, I mean, this is an opportunity. They're not growing something in the soil by design 60% of the time. This is kind of a neat deal. The other thing would be kind of easy is there's a lot of livestock guys that typically are not really your high-end farmers. They'll grow a little feed over here or something to feed their cows. Another opportunity here for those guys would simply be to take this low input method, which is a system they're already currently using, and maybe take it just slightly to the next level. Okay? Here's a little picture of the mycorrhizal fungi. I ought to let Teresa stand up and explain it. But essentially, our muscular, word meaning tree, and these are like little tree-like structures. Sometimes I have a hard time seeing it, but essentially what's interesting about this, as I understand it, the mycorrhizal fungi allows the root system, the individual roots, to explore up to 20 times more amount of soil. And that allows it to exploit or collaborate or perhaps more efficiently use the water and the nutrients simply by expanding the opportunities of that root system. Somewhere there was a study, and I wish we had the slide in here, but essentially it was a dramatic effect on a green growing corn crop with and without mycorrhizal fungi about the water use efficiency. And I don't have those numbers up here, but it was kind of interesting. Here's actually what it looks like under the microscope. These little hair-like, thread-like projections. This is coming off a corn root. That's essentially how that's happening. And they can bring it back in. They're exchanging water and nutrients right here. And this is what they look like inside the root structure. That's at 1,000 times magnification. We talked a little bit about here. Nutrients scavenged from the soil by mycorrhizal fungi are traded for carbon on the herbuscule. Remember we talked about how essential carbon was to this deal? We always think about nitrogen being the limiting factor. But without that carbon in the system, we're going to limit what can happen in that soil. Glomalin, Mike touched on that a little bit. I think I'll probably cut this part of the conversation down. It was discovered by Dr. Sarah Wright in 1996. I had the opportunity to visit and see a few times Dr. Christine Nichols, who also worked there a little bit. Essentially, it is the glue that's produced by, is it a byproduct of the mycorrhizal fungi?
I think so.
Okay.
That was discovered after I had worked in that lab, but they were trying to figure out what biochemical was responsible for that.
Okay. Essentially, and somebody mentioned this earlier, it binds. It helps bind those aggregates together, and it's basically water insoluble. It's not readily dissolved in water. One of the things, and I don't see it happening here. I was kind of looking here. You can see a little bit of it here on this one particular aggregate here. Yesterday, when we did this in Steamboat, we had a piece of CRP in there, and it stayed clear. The water was clear. Not much happening down here, and nothing floating on the top. But on the disturbed and the really disturbed, there was kind of this film on there that looked like a bathtub ring. Now what I understand, that's part of that glue being released. It's floating on the top because it does not readily dissolve in water. Essentially this is just, they've dyed this, I guess. They made it so you can see it with the microscope. Here's maybe a little bit more of a visual on how that might work. Soil before the extraction, if you could just take out the glomalin, what you would have. You remember those two clods or soils we piled up earlier? Remember how that one was darker than the other one? Just something to think about. Here's a site similar to the one I mentioned earlier about Hugh Hammond Bennett. This comes from South Carolina. What's neat about this, they essentially had a forested area. Originally it was all forested. They broke out this little strip right in here. It's 17 acres. And they did it 17 years ago. I don't know exactly what the acres are, but a small amount of acreage is broken out here. The farmland was farmed for 17 years in a corn-soybean rotation. Over here the forest, doing just what it does. Mother Nature's taking care of things with diversity, keeping the soil covered at all times, live rooted soil, no tillage. They went back and looked after 17 years, and you can kind of see some things here. I'm just going to illustrate a couple things here with the mouse clicker. Bulk density, and I think BJ talked about this a little bit earlier in his presentation. When that soil organic matter is going down, basically the net effect is the ratio of the rocks to organic matters going the other way. So it's about 39% more dense than that forested site. But more interestingly enough, to me, look at the infiltration rate per hour. I'm going to touch with